I'm Melissa Brooks, 34 years old, a financial advisor based in Chicago, and last month, I discovered that the people I'd spent a lifetime protecting were ready to tear me apart the second I said no. It all began with a text from my mother. Family meeting. Saturday at 3. Your presence is expected. No context, no request, just a command. Classic Martha Brooks. In our family, that kind of tone usually meant my younger brother Bradley had gotten himself into another mess. And as always, I was supposed to clean it up. I stared at the message, my phone buzzing again before I could even finish processing. Don't be late. We have something important to discuss. I felt it in my gut, that tight, unmistakable knot that had been forming more and more often lately. I'd spent most of my adult life cleaning up my family's financial disasters while they lived like I was their personal safety net. I paid for Bradley's rehab, twice. Covered a surprise second mortgage my father took out behind my mother's back. Paid off my mother's credit card debt more times than I could count. But things were different now. Because last year, when my grandmother Eleanor passed away, she left behind more than just memories and her signature lavender perfume. She left me control of the family trust. The entire trust. Not a portion. Not a shared pool of assets. Me. Alone. Eleanor wasn't naive. She had seen exactly who in our family treated money like oxygen and who treated it like fire. She knew Bradley would burn through every penny in a year. She knew my parents, blinded by appearances, would drain every account for the sake of status and illusion. And so, she chose me. The daughter they overlooked. The granddaughter she trusted. But the reading of her will hadn't gone over well. Not even close. My father sat silent, face red. My mother cried, loudly, theatrically. And Bradley? He laughed like it was a joke and asked where the real documents were. I should have walked away that day. But I didn't. Because part of me still wanted to believe family meant something. Now, 3 months later, I was being summoned. The house I grew up in felt smaller than I remembered. The walls were yellowed with time, the air thick with tension. I walked into the living room and froze. They were all there, my mother, my father, Bradley, and 2 men in expensive suits sitting at the far end of the table. Legal pads open. Briefcases beside their chairs. Lawyers. My mother stood, smile tight, arms folded across her pristine blouse. Melissa, she said, her voice cool. Meet our attorneys. Attorneys? For what? I glanced at Bradley, who smirked and tossed a crumpled gum wrapper into a wastebasket like he was already celebrating. What's going on? I asked, my voice steady despite the alarm bells screaming in my head. Just some paperwork, my father said dismissively. A small adjustment to the trust. To reflect what's fair. Fair? I echoed. Fair would have been Eleanor leaving it to the family, my mother snapped. Not hoarding everything in your name like some power trip. Bradley stood and added, we just want what's rightfully ours. And just like that, I realized what this was. They weren't here to ask. They were here to take. But they had no idea, I'd already moved the assets. I'd already anticipated this very moment. And I'd come prepared. Next Saturday, they were hosting another family meeting to try again. Only this time? I'd be the one holding all the cards. And they wouldn't see it coming. After that ambush in the living room, seeing their smug faces, those 2 lawyers with open folders already halfway through drafting whatever adjustment they were planning, I drove straight to Eleanor's house. Or, as it's formally known now, the Eleanor J. Brooks estate. A name I had legally registered within weeks of the will being finalized. It wasn't just a house. It was where I'd grown up, emotionally, at least. While my parents were busy putting out fires caused by Bradley or hosting fundraisers we couldn't afford, I'd spend my weekends, holidays, and countless summer afternoons in Eleanor's kitchen, my elbows on her weathered oak table, learning everything that mattered. That house smelled like cinnamon, lemon oil, and structure. It was where homework had been sacred, where shoes were left at the door without complaint, where expectations were high but never cruel. Eleanor had been tough, unapologetically so, but never unfair. She ran her life the same way she ran her investments, with dignity, patience, and an eye on the long game. Sitting in her now quiet sunroom, surrounded by shelves of old financial journals and yellowing paperback novels, I thought about the first time she showed me her portfolio. I was 15. My mother was busy arguing with a dress shop about the color of Bradley's prom tux, and I was supposed to be spending the afternoon reorganizing Eleanor's closet. But she had something different in mind. She said, "Melissa, I need you to understand something. The world will always be louder for men like your father and your brother. Your job is to listen underneath the noise." She handed me a printed statement showing the compounded growth of one of her older mutual funds. It didn't look exciting, not flashy or dramatic. Just steady gains over years. She pointed to the small, consistent numbers. "This," she said, "is how power builds." That moment has stayed with me longer than any birthday, graduation, or work milestone. It was the first time anyone looked at me and saw potential instead of obligation. My parents never noticed when I made honor roll. Bradley crashed his car into a tree during my college orientation weekend. That's what they remembered. My mother had actually forgotten which college I chose until she saw the university logo on my sweatshirt at Thanksgiving. Eleanor remembered everything. She had a notebook, leather-bound, pages crinkled at the edges, where she tracked every milestone I reached. Not just grades or awards, but things like, "Melissa fixed the kitchen sink by herself today," and "Melissa taught me how to use online banking." I found it in the drawer next to her bed after she died. I keep it now in a fireproof safe with her will. The contrast between the life I lived with her and the one I endured in my parents' home was impossible to ignore. At Eleanor's, I was being prepared. At home, I was being used. I started noticing it more after high school. When I got a job as a teller at a local bank during college, my father laughed. "That's not real finance," he'd said. "That's just pushing buttons." But that job taught me more than he ever did: how people behave when they think no one's watching. Who floats checks? Who withdraws the last $7 in their account at midnight? Who saves in silence? I studied those behaviors. I remembered the names. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in financial planning, my mother didn't attend. She said she had the flu, but I found pictures of her and Bradley at a Cubs game that same weekend. Eleanor was there, though. Front row, in a powder blue suit, applauding like I'd just won a Nobel. After I started my own advisory firm, I made a decision that changed everything. I asked Eleanor to become my first real client. Not because I wanted to manage her assets, but because I wanted to show her how far her guidance had taken me. She agreed, reluctantly. I think she enjoyed letting me take the reins, even if she always kept a mental tally in her head of what every account should be. She was sharp that way, right until the end. Over the next few years, as I built my firm and my name, Eleanor began shifting her own investments, away from the old advisors, away from the firms my father respected, and into entities I managed or oversaw. Quietly. Intentionally. She was building a future she could trust. When her health declined, she called me into her bedroom one evening. "You're the only one who doesn't take what hasn't been earned," she said. She meant more than money. Eleanor never forgot that when Bradley totaled his second car, my parents used the money she'd set aside for my first apartment to cover his legal fees. They never told me, but she did. I still remember how her voice shook, not from weakness, but from anger. "Melissa," she said, "I won't be around forever. But what I've built, that needs to stay in clean hands." It was the only time I saw her cry. From that day forward, she began making plans. Discreetly restructuring the estate. Moving assets. Refining her will. She let my parents believe they were still in control, still the center of her legacy. And she kept me in the loop for every single decision. When I became the sole trustee, it wasn't a surprise. It was a promise fulfilled. The others never saw it coming because they never saw me. Not really. To them, I was the fixer, the silent achiever, the one who would clean up the messes and never complain. They mistook my quiet for weakness. They confused kindness for consent. They never realized that every dinner I attended, every check I wrote, every mess I absorbed, it was all noted. Documented. Remembered. Eleanor taught me that memory is a kind of currency. And I had more than they knew. Now they were coming for what wasn't theirs. And for the first time in my life, I was going to tell them no. The days following the so-called family meeting were quiet. Too quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that feels like a vacuum right before a building implodes. My phone stayed suspiciously silent. No texts. No calls. Even my father, who normally sent daily emails about tax write-offs or vague investment opportunities for Bradley, went dark. I knew what that meant. They were regrouping. The silence was not surrender, it was strategy. And sure enough, by Friday, the pressure began. It started subtly. An email from a financial institution where the Brooks Family Trust had previously held a portfolio Eleanor had closed before her death. The subject line read, "Urgent, documentation request." At first, I thought it was a mistake, routine compliance noise. But something about the tone was off. They were asking questions about ownership transfers that had occurred more than 6 months ago. Then another email came. This time from a legal assistant at a small law firm in Winnetka with ties to my parents' social circle. They were reviewing documents related to a potential dispute over the trust's beneficiary structure. The words were carefully chosen. Non-threatening. Polite. But I knew what they were doing. My parents weren't trying to negotiate. They were trying to trap me. I called Veronica immediately. She picked up on the first ring. "They're testing the perimeter," I said flatly. She didn't ask what I meant. She never had to. For as long as we'd worked together, Veronica had been more than my partner, she was my compass. We met in college, bonded in grad school, and started our firm on the bones of our shared burnout from working under arrogant, predatory male bosses in downtown finance. She was the first person I told about the inheritance. The only one who knew how deep the roots of my family dysfunction really went. "They'll come at you emotionally next," she warned. And she was right. That Sunday, my father called. Not emailed. Called. I watched his name flash on my screen and let it ring 4 times before answering. That pause was deliberate, a small act of resistance I knew he'd feel. He didn't waste time. He said they'd been thinking and that perhaps there had been a miscommunication regarding the trust. Then came the pivot. That Eleanor had always wanted to keep the family together, and that maybe I should consider what that meant now. He didn't say Bradley's name. He didn't have to. The conversation felt less like a talk and more like a performance. He used phrases like legacy preservation and shared family stewardship, peppering in half references to public perception and respecting tradition. It was never about money. That was the trick. They never used the word. Because if they said money, I could say no, but if they said family, it became emotional blackmail wrapped in civility. Later that evening, a text from my mother arrived. "Bradley's been struggling again. We just want him to have a chance." Is that so wrong? Struggling again? After the rehab, the debt forgiveness, the business loan that disappeared into online poker accounts? And now, after everything, they wanted me to sign over control of Eleanor's trust because of that? I didn't reply. Not because I didn't have words. But because I had too many. The next day, I opened my office and found a bouquet of white lilies on my desk. There was no card. Just a folded piece of notebook paper with handwriting I knew too well. Remember what Eleanor would have wanted. Manipulation disguised as nostalgia. A signature move. By midweek, it escalated. Bradley called me for the first time in months. His voice was subdued, even sincere, but I recognized the tone. He rambled about how hard things had been. How he'd been working on himself. How unfair it was that our grandmother would pit us against each other like this. Then he started crying. I sat in silence, letting him fill the space with apologies and half-truths. Then he said it. "Melissa, if you don't do something soon, this will destroy us." That was the sentence. The line they had clearly rehearsed. Not a threat. Not a plea. A burden disguised as a bond. He wanted me to feel responsible. Not for the trust, but for the entire family's emotional survival. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, replaying every conversation. Every veiled accusation. Every moment they tried to reframe my integrity as cruelty. It wasn't about justice. It was about guilt. I could hear Eleanor's voice in my head, calm but firm. "Guilt is a thief, Melissa. It steals your judgment and leaves you broke." By Friday, the pressure was unbearable. My parents invited me to dinner. Just us, the text said. No lawyers. No tension. Just a chance to talk. But I knew what it would be. More manipulation. More of them painting themselves as the victims and me as the cold-hearted gatekeeper. I didn't go. Instead, I met Veronica at a small jazz bar near our office. I hadn't told her everything yet, just fragments. But that night, it all poured out. Every phone call. Every email. Every carefully crafted guilt trip disguised as concern. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. When I finished, she simply said, "So, what's the plan?" And that's when I knew. The line had been crossed. There was no more negotiation, no more appeals to family sentiment. It was time to act. I went home and opened the file drawer I hadn't touched in months. Inside was a manila folder Eleanor had labeled in her loopy script, "In case they come for you." Inside were bank statements. Letters. Signed directives. Asset transfers dated back years. Proof. Proof that she had prepared for exactly this scenario. That she had known them better than they knew themselves. I spent the weekend scanning, indexing, and logging everything. Veronica helped me draw up contingency plans. I pulled out every legal agreement, every clause, every fail-safe Eleanor had built into the trust. They wanted a war? They were about to see what it looked like when the family fixer finally stopped fixing and started fighting back. The truth is, I'd been preparing for this long before the lawyers ever showed up at the family meeting. It started months earlier, during the final weeks of Eleanor's life. She hadn't said it outright, but I could read between the lines. The way she chose her words. The careful steps she took to ensure her wishes weren't just written, but fortified. She wasn't just giving me an inheritance. She was passing me a responsibility. A fortress I'd have to defend against the people who claimed to love me. When she passed, I didn't grieve in the way others expected. I didn't collapse into tears or retreat into solitude. I got to work. I began by creating backups of every document associated with her estate. Digital and hard copies. Fireproof safes and encrypted cloud storage. A redundancy system worthy of a tech firm, not a family home. But it was necessary. Because I knew my family. And I knew what they were capable of when they felt entitled. Veronica helped me draw up new trust protections right after the will was finalized. We amended the terms of the successor trustee structure to require unanimous consent among neutral third-party advisors for any major asset movement. We set up a layered LLC system that separated Eleanor's assets into 3 independent silos, making them harder to trace, and much harder to challenge. Each time I got a text from my parents in those early months, under the guise of friendly check-ins, I noted them. Each time Bradley made some veiled joke about our inheritance over dinner, I logged the time, date, and context. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. After their ambush with the lawyers, I took the next step. I hired my own. Not just 1, 3. And estate litigator. A forensic accountant. and a private wealth attorney with experience in interfamily disputes. Each had no personal or professional overlap with my parents' network. Discretion was paramount. We met in an off-site conference room Veronica rented through a contact in the loop. I laid out every document, every clause of Eleanor's will, every trust statement, every file I'd pulled from my private archives. They spent hours combing through the materials. Their verdict was unanimous: the trust was airtight. Eleanor's language had been meticulous, her intentions clear. But clarity didn't stop manipulation. It didn't stop lawsuits. They warned me of the games families play, not legal ones, but emotional. Lies disguised as misunderstandings. Forged documents. Misleading narratives crafted for public sympathy. So I doubled down. I had all communications with my parents routed through a secondary line. No more informal texts or calls. Everything was documented. Timestamped. Stored. I also installed a home security system, not because I expected violence, but because I knew how desperation makes people reckless. Cameras. Logs. Alerts. I wanted a record of everyone who stepped near my door. And then there was the journal. The one Eleanor left me. In the back, she had written a list of questions to ask when people start making noise. It was classic Eleanor, cryptic, sharp, and devastatingly accurate. What changed their opinion after she died? What did they stand to lose? Why didn't they protest the will when she was alive? Why now? I wrote my own questions beneath hers. Why had I spent 30 years trying to earn the approval of people who never saw me? Why had I tolerated being the family's fallback, the fixer, the quiet one who never needed help? Why had I mistaken my silence for strength? As I built my defense, I also started preparing for the confrontation. It was inevitable. They'd push again. And this time I wouldn't show up alone. I wouldn't let their charm or manipulation drag me back into emotional submission. I rehearsed scenarios with Veronica and my attorney. We role-played conversations. We practiced responding to guilt trips, to gaslighting, to thinly veiled threats. We ran through questions I'd likely face, from relatives, from mutual friends, even from the press if things went public. But preparation wasn't just legal. It was emotional. That part was harder. It meant going through old family photos and separating memory from mythology. It meant finally deleting voicemails I'd kept for years, messages where my mother oscillated between coldness and performative affection. It meant reading old birthday cards from Bradley, filled with jokes about how one day we'd split the jackpot, and realizing he'd never really known me. Eleanor had. And honoring her meant facing the truth, not just about them, but about myself. I was no longer the girl who held her breath during family dinners, hoping someone would notice her GPA. I wasn't the woman who swallowed her pride and wrote another check to cover her brother's third failed business. I wasn't even the granddaughter who wanted to prove herself worthy of Eleanor's faith. I was the trustee now. And I was ready. The moment came quicker than I expected. A courier arrived at my office with a thick envelope, my name typed across the front, no return address. Inside was a formal letter from my parents' lawyers. They were contesting the trust. They claimed I was unfit to manage the assets. That Eleanor had been under undue influence. That my decisions represented a pattern of exclusionary behavior inconsistent with family values. The language was careful. Legal. Strategic. It was also insulting. They weren't just coming for the money. They were coming for my name. I placed the letter beside the others. Scanned it. Filed it. Logged it. Then I reached for the file labeled, Response Plan, Phase 2. Inside was everything I needed. Bank records showing Eleanor's independent transactions. Medical records showing her mental clarity in the months prior to her death. Recordings of conversations, fully legal, fully documented, where she expressed her wishes plainly. And most importantly, a signed, notarized video of Eleanor herself, dated 6 months before her death, explaining in her own words why she chose me. It wasn't a tearful farewell. It was a business statement. A final one. In it, she looked directly at the camera and said, "If you're watching this, it means they came after Melissa. And it means I was right to prepare." That video, more than anything, was my armor. I watched it once, quietly. Then I sent a copy to my attorney, along with instructions to play it in full at the next meeting. Because the confrontation was coming. And this time, I'd be the one setting the terms. They set the meeting for a Sunday afternoon. My parents' choice, of course. Their house, their rules. Bradley would be there, along with their lawyers. A formal invitation was sent this time, printed on ivory stationery as if this were a brunch or a baby shower. It even had RSVP instructions at the bottom. I responded the same way I prepared for everything else. Methodically. Deliberately. Without emotion. I arrived 10 minutes early, not out of eagerness, but control. I parked at the curb instead of the driveway and sat in my car for a moment, breathing in silence. My hands rested on the leather binder in the passenger seat. Inside were the documents I'd prepared for weeks, the paper trail Eleanor had left me, the evidence I'd built layer by layer, and the final piece, the video testimony. Her voice. Her clarity. Her last word. The front door opened before I knocked. My father. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe just smaller. He moved aside without speaking. No greeting. No warmth. Just silence as I stepped into the foyer where my entire childhood existed in beige carpet and carefully framed disappointment. The living room was arranged like a courtroom. My mother on one end of the long sectional. Bradley lounging across an armchair like he'd already won. Two suited men beside him, one with a legal pad, the other with a laptop. Coffee was served. The fireplace was lit, though it was 72 degrees outside. Every element was curated to project authority. But they had no idea what was coming. I didn't sit immediately. I stood near the edge of the room, setting my binder on the coffee table and scanning each face. My mother looked smug. My father unreadable. Bradley didn't bother to hide his amusement. I was the odd one out, the responsible daughter now dressed like the opposition. One of the attorneys opened the meeting, his voice pleasant but patronizing. He spoke of the tense circumstances surrounding Eleanor's will. He used words like reconciliation, mutual understanding, and clarity of intent. Then he pivoted. He said they had concerns. Concerns about my conduct. Concerns about Eleanor's mental state at the time the trust was amended. Concerns that perhaps I had exercised undue influence, manipulated her emotionally, isolated her from the family, taken advantage of her declining health. I let him speak. I watched my mother nod solemnly, as if burdened by the weight of this imagined betrayal. My father said nothing. Bradley made a theatrical sigh when the attorney paused. Then I opened my binder. And I started with the easiest truths. Medical records, signed by Eleanor's primary physician, stating she had full cognitive function through the date of the trust's final update. Full capacity. No impairment. No ambiguity. Then, the financial documents, bank records showing Eleanor independently transferring her assets over a period of 18 months. Transfers she initiated on her own, in person, with two-factor verification. I had signed receipts. Witness logs. Every dollar accounted for. I slid each set of papers across the table, page by page. No one spoke. I continued. I pulled out a transcript, Veronica had helped me compile it. A record of every call, every text, every email my parents had sent me since the reading of the will. None were questions. None were conversations. All were demands. Accusations. Guilt-drenched ultimatums. I paused only once, long enough to hand over a small flash drive. "That's from Eleanor," I said. "You'll want to play it now." My father frowned. My mother's eyes narrowed. Bradley scoffed. But the attorney inserted the drive into his laptop and turned the screen toward the group. And then Eleanor appeared. There she was, sitting in her sunroom in the afternoon light. Her voice was steady. Her eyes clear. She looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this, it means my family is once again trying to turn Melissa into the villain. She spoke without anger. Just precision. She explained her decisions in full, her trust in me, her disappointment in the rest. She named names. She described behaviors. She even listed dates. She anticipated everything. You don't get to call it love when it only comes with conditions, she said. You don't get to claim family loyalty when you ignored me while I was alive. The video ended. Silence filled the room. Not the kind that invited peace. The kind that demanded reckoning. Bradley stood first. He muttered something about the video being edited. That it didn't change anything. That I was still selfish for keeping everything. My mother turned on the attorney. How could you let her bring that here? That video wasn't part of the original estate packet. He replied calmly, it's admissible. It's time-stamped. And it supports her position. My father said nothing. Just stared at the carpet like it held answers. I picked up my binder and stood. Then I spoke, quietly, clearly, and only once. You asked for a family meeting. This is what accountability looks like. No one replied. I walked out of the house without a backward glance. By the time I reached my car, my hands weren't shaking. They'd come to break me. Instead, they broke their illusion of control. They couldn't touch me anymore. And they knew it. After the confrontation, there was no dramatic follow-up. No second summons. No frantic phone calls. Just silence, the kind that feels less like resolution and more like retreat. But I knew better than to mistake stillness for peace. The next morning, I sat in my office before sunrise, a legal pad on my desk, pen in hand. The city hadn't woken up yet. Outside, the lake shimmered under the last edge of night. My coffee went cold before I took a sip. The list I wrote wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't even about defense. It was about order. The estate was secure. Eleanor's wishes had been confirmed. Legally, I didn't have to do anything more. But ethics ran deeper than obligation. And I hadn't spent years building a life of integrity just to win by technicality. So I began closing the loopholes. Locking every gate. First, I worked with my attorney to establish a trust amendment that ensured no future successor could override the original terms without judicial review. I named a panel of 3 independent advisors, all financial professionals with no personal ties to my family, to serve as trustees in my absence. I established a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name, seeded with $250,000 from a separate account she had once earmarked for emergencies. In her journal, she'd written, "Use this if the family ever becomes one." I knew she meant if we ever reconciled. But I also knew she would rather see that money serve strangers with ambition than family with entitlement. Then I turned to the property. Eleanor's home, still beautifully preserved, still filled with her scent and her silence, needed new life. I had resisted selling it, not because I wanted to live there, but because it felt wrong to reduce it to market value. That house had built me. So I contacted a legal clinic that supported young women aging out of foster care, and I began the process of converting the property into a transitional living and training center. It would become a place of growth. Like it had been for me. There was backlash, of course. My parents' attorney sent one final letter, bland in tone but filled with frustration. Our clients regret the current breakdown in familial communication and remain hopeful for a more equitable resolution. My reply was one sentence long: the trust has been executed in accordance with all legal and ethical obligations. And that was the last they heard from me. Bradley sent a few texts over the next month, some accusatory, some oddly sentimental. He even left a voicemail one night that began with a mumbled apology before veering into a rant about how I never let things go. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I focused on rebuilding, not my family, but my space, my energy. I took a 2-week sabbatical from the firm. Veronica managed the clients while I disappeared into the quiet of northern Wisconsin. A rented cabin. No Wi-Fi. Just books, walks, and Eleanor's journal. I read it again from beginning to end, not for strategy this time, but for peace. On the final page, she had written, "Integrity doesn't protect you from heartbreak. But it gives you something to stand on when everything else falls." When I returned to Chicago, the firm was thriving. Veronica had on board 2 new clients, one of whom mentioned they had heard about the scholarship fund and wanted to invest in similar philanthropic work. It occurred to me that Eleanor's legacy was already expanding, even as my family tried to erase it. I made one last visit to the house. The renovations were underway. The backyard was being converted into a shared garden. The library, once filled with Eleanor's financial ledgers, would soon be a tutoring room. As I walked through each room, I felt the tension release from my shoulders like it was dissolving into the drywall. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Grief had already done its work. What remained was purpose. Before I left, I sat in the sunroom, Eleanor's favorite chair still in place, the cushion slightly worn where she used to rest her elbow. I closed my eyes and listened to the hum of tools outside, the laughter of contractors, the slow beat of construction. It sounded like healing. Later that week, I called my cousin Natalie, the only relative who hadn't picked sides. She lived in Denver now, taught at a public high school, and had kept a quiet distance from the family drama. We hadn't spoken in over a year. When she answered, her voice caught. "I heard what they did to you," she said. "I'm sorry." We talked for over an hour. Not just about the trust, but about life. About choices. About what it means to stand up for yourself when no one claps. She told me she was proud of me. It was the first time in months I felt connected to someone with my name. A week later, she emailed me asking if she could contribute to the scholarship fund. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something. The next time I saw Bradley was unplanned. He was coming out of a courthouse downtown, probably for one of his many license suspensions or debt hearings. He looked thinner. His eyes avoided mine. He didn't speak. Neither did I. That silence didn't hurt. Because I no longer mistook silence for absence. I understood now that sometimes choosing distance is the most loving thing you can do, for yourself. I didn't try to change them. I didn't seek revenge. I honored the woman who raised me, protected the legacy she entrusted to me, and reclaimed the part of myself that had been lost in the chaos of other people's expectations. This wasn't the ending I had imagined for my family. But it was the one I chose. And that made all the difference. It's been 6 months since that final meeting. In that time, I haven't heard a word from my parents. No texts. No emails. Not even the passive-aggressive birthday card I used to receive every year with a line or two of forced sentiment. Nothing. At first, that silence echoed in my bones. It felt wrong, almost unnatural, like a constant hum that suddenly stopped. I kept waiting for something to break it. For Bradley to appear with one more demand. For my mother to call and act like none of it had happened. For my father to reach out under the guise of clarifying logistics. But they didn't. And slowly, I stopped waiting. The quiet became space. And in that space, I began to hear myself again. My days no longer start with dread. I no longer scan my inbox with anxiety or check caller ID with a knot in my stomach. I go to work, meet with clients, strategize long-term portfolios, and when I come home, I don't feel like I've run a marathon through emotional landmines. The firm has expanded. Veronica and I hired another advisor, a recent graduate from Eleanor's alma mater. She reminds me of who I was at 22, driven, skeptical, endlessly curious. Watching her grow has become a kind of therapy for me, like witnessing the unfolding of potential without the weight of old expectations. The scholarship fund in Eleanor's name received more contributions than we expected. Not just from clients or relatives, but from strangers, people who had read the press release, found the website, and written heartfelt notes about the impact someone like Eleanor could have on a life. I read every single message. Some came from women my age. Others from students. One came from a single father who said he'd been saving newspaper clippings about financial literacy programs for his teenage daughter and wanted to support a cause that helped young people like her understand money without fear. Eleanor would have loved that. And the house, that beautiful brick fortress on the edge of Lakeview Avenue, now pulses with life again. I visit every few weeks. The rooms are different now, painted in soft pastels, filled with donated books and handmade art from the girls who live there. The sunroom, once Eleanor's sanctuary, is now a shared quiet space where residents journal, meditate, or simply sit in silence with a view of the back garden. One afternoon, I walked in during a group discussion. A teenage girl was reading aloud from her notebook about what stability meant to her. She said it wasn't money or a place, it was knowing she could walk into a space and be herself without consequence. That moment stayed with me. Because I finally realized that's what I had built, too. Not just for them, but for me. My sense of self is no longer tangled in the barbed wire of my family's approval. I don't measure my success in their reactions or their validation. I measure it in peace. In the quiet confidence that I made hard decisions and stood by them, not out of pride, but out of love for something deeper than convenience. Eleanor's journal still sits in my safe. I don't read it every day anymore. But on the harder ones, those late evenings when loneliness tries to rewrite history, I open it and trace her handwriting with my fingers. It reminds me that I was never alone in this. And I'm not now. Because something unexpected grew in the ruins of my family's collapse, community. Natalie and I talk weekly now. She's helping develop an educational component for the scholarship program, financial literacy workshops designed for high school seniors in underfunded districts. We're even planning a speaking series for young women in transitional housing, where I'll share what I know about navigating money, pressure, and power. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm building the kind of support system I never had growing up. But that's how healing works sometimes. You don't just mend your wounds. You become the balm for others. I've learned that integrity doesn't guarantee comfort. In fact, choosing what's right over what's easy often isolates you in the beginning. But the longer you walk that path, the more clearly you see who is walking it with you. And those are the people who matter. I don't know if my family will ever come around. Maybe they'll rewrite the story in their heads, cast themselves as victims, or believe I turned on them without cause. Maybe they'll never acknowledge what really happened. And I've made peace with that. Because I know the truth. I didn't burn the bridge. I simply stopped building it alone. I honored my grandmother's wishes. I protected the legacy she left behind, not just the assets, but the values. I drew a line where none had ever existed before and said, this far, no further. I stood firm. And I stood alone. But now, I am not alone. I have people beside me, colleagues, friends, the girls at the house, even strangers who saw themselves in my story. And if you've made it this far, maybe you see yourself in it too. Maybe you've been the fixer. The quiet one. The one who gave and was told that love meant never saying no. Or maybe you've been told that doing the right thing means hurting no one, and so when standing up for yourself caused pain, you felt ashamed. Let me tell you something. Doing the right thing doesn't mean no one gets hurt. It means you don't lie to yourself to make everyone else comfortable. It means you choose truth, even when the room turns cold. It means you fight, not out of spite, but out of love for the version of yourself who still believed she had to earn safety by sacrificing her peace. That's the lesson Eleanor gave me. And now, I give it to you. If you've ever faced something similar, a family battle, a financial betrayal, a moment where doing what's right meant doing it alone, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. And if this story meant something to you, if it made you feel seen, or gave you courage, please hit that like button and subscribe. Because this community? It's for all of us who chose truth and are finally ready to live it.